Thank you so much, Dr. Payne. Thank you, Linda. Thank you to one of my mentors, Dr. Marcia Della Justina, for inviting me to participate in this great event. It's been a fascinating day with a lot of great conversations, a lot of interesting topics as we look ahead to next week's elections, as we look ahead to our future and to democracy not only here in the United States, but around the world. I'm gonna change the protocol a little bit. I'm gonna do my introduction of Eric here sitting down because we really want to try to engage everyone in a dialogue. We'll start the dialogue here on stage between us, and then we really want to open it up to all of you because just based on some of the questions I've heard already today, I think that we're going to have a lot of questions for Eric because he touches upon a lot of the topics and themes that have come up already throughout the day, and I think he's going to be able to give interesting insight and create an interesting discussion with everybody on how we see democracy and what these disruptors are that that are already developing and that can come in the future. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Eric. Eric Schnurer is the founder and president of Public Works LLC, a public policy consulting firm that works with state and local governments across the country in improving government management, policy, and strategic planning. He served as gubernatorial chief of staff and speechwriter to governors, senators, and presidential candidates. He is a former National Woodrow Wilson Fellow and former adjunct professor at Brown, the University of Pennsylvania, Drexel University, Temple University, and the University of Chicago, where he taught on the future of government. Eric holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University, a master's degree in public policy from Harvard School of Government, and a law degree from Columbia University Law School. So one of the main points that we are using as the opening for the discussion today is an article that Eric wrote last summer for the Hedgehog Review, the academic journal from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture from University of Virginia, where he touches upon this topic of democracy disrupted through the lens of how technology is going to act in that disruption. So I wanted to open up the conversation, Eric, by just asking you, what are these disruptors that you have been seeing as you have been looking at this topic for several years, and if you could expand on what you see as this democracy disrupted?
Sure. And is this working? Yes, it is working. Great. Well, first of all, thanks all of you for having me here today. You're, I think, mostly communicators and in communication, so most of you will realize that Democracy Disrupted, which this session takes its name from, which is an article that I wrote, was actually not the title that I ever came up with for the article. That comes from my editor. I think I would think of this more as democracy in evolution, and I think that's an important thing to think about, which I'll get into for a second. I've had the privilege of doing a lot of discussions like this since the article came out a couple months ago, including one at Emerson's Politics and Pizza, which was a thrill because I won the pizza. So I was really happy to be invited back. I'm hoping there's another pizza involved. But the other reason is because all these talks that I've been giving have been virtual and online. And this is the first chance in several years to actually be in a room with other human beings and have some interaction about this. But I noticed earlier as I was looking around the room, and I'm looking around the room now and seeing kind of the same thing, that at any given time about half the people are kind of staring at these things. And that's a lot of the world that we live in, and has a lot to do with everything that we've been discussing today. I noticed, as Flora did, how much these discussions are all interrelated. Even the sports discussion that we last had, I was very struck by Stan Nance's comment about the necessity of rebuilding community. And it's not just a matter of the pandemic. It's something that we're going through on a large scale and have been for quite some time. And part of it is everybody's staring at these phones. I don't want to be critical about that, and I think this is an important thing to get, that people think it's kind of a either or, it's really great or it's really, really negative, and opinions have shifted back and forth on that over the last couple of decades. But, it can be both simultaneously. Those of you who are staring at these phones are, you're kind of checked out of this particular community, but you're engaged simultaneously in creating your own community and your own realities with people all over the world whenever you want to be doing that, having the conversations you want to be having. That's really tremendous. On the other hand, we're not creating community in this room at that time. And one thing that Flora and I think we want to address today is to create a community, and hopefully you'll all join us, that we're not talking to each other in front of you, but we'll be talking with you. So hopefully we'll be exciting enough that everybody puts their phones down. I don't know that that's possible, but it's a metaphor for what we're seeing in society generally and what's happening with democracy. One of the main points in the article, and as a writer, and I'm sure all of you as communicators will appreciate this, I hope everybody goes out and reads this article. You can find it online, Democracy Disrupted, and if you can spell my name right, it'll pull down the article. But one of the main points in it is the centrality of the dominant technology at any time to how people think and how societies are structured, and that includes everything from family living arrangements and daily life to how we govern ourselves and structure social hierarchies and so forth. And if you look throughout history, these have changed with the technologies, because the technology that we're using, usually with our hands, also affects how we think. So if you look at most of the religious conceptions that we have today that came from largely the Middle East several thousand years ago, a lot of the metaphors about God and how God works are in terms of pastoral societies and God as a shepherd. When you get to the Middle Ages and the rise of mechanization, what you get a lot of is the idea of a clockwork universe, God as the great watchmaker, which is a metaphor that's still used a lot today. But it's not just theologically. That becomes the framework for what was the dominant ideology about how society was and should be structured. That we lived in a world that worked like clockwork. Everybody knew their place. You do your thing. It doesn't change. And this was used to essentially enforce a certain kind of political and social structure. Now you can think that, oh well, that's just back then when people were less advanced and we're so much more sophisticated. But virtually every social and political institution that we have today in this country was shaped explicitly, and I mean explicitly, by the factory that arose in the late 18th and early 19th century. Our prison system, our mental health system, our welfare system, which was back then the poorhouse, the asylum. When I start talking about this, any school teacher in the room will raise their hand and say our school system. These were all expressly designed to mimic the factory, both in terms of their physical structure and how they operated on the people who were consigned to them. And in many ways, our social structures are still structured around that. If you take a walk around this city in the Federal Triangle and look at the government ministries, they're all constructed at the height of the industrial era. At least to me, they look an awful lot like the factories and mill towns of Pennsylvania, where I live. So, the technologies shape how we think and how we conceive of just about everything. And, we still haven't gotten over that. What's the main model of how the universe is structured that you see in popular culture today? We all live inside of a video game. Well, these things shape how we look at everything. And so I think it's important to understand what is this technology, what is this phone and these other digital technologies we're dealing with, and then how does that affect our social structures, and particularly our government. The way that most people think and talk about this nowadays is, well, obviously, these digital technologies are all leading to centralization and authoritarianism, which is, I think, what we'll spend most of our time thinking about. I don't think that's true. I think exactly the opposite. I think that digital technologies are decentralizing and democratizing in such an extreme, actually, that's why we're having the problems that we're having. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples, and we'll start talking about this some more. At one end of the spectrum, you can have blockchain technology, which is about a lot more than just, hinky finances. It's a way of creating a community that is self-selecting, self-governing, and you can have what we used to want to get out of government, which was trust and rules that were enforced, and punishment if you didn't obey the rules. But now what blockchain does is it can create that through a mechanism where there is no central authority, there is no king. Everybody involved in that community is in fact the enforcer, the structure, the rules. All the authority is distributed to everybody that's a part of that community. At the other end of the spectrum, from the wholly digital to the physical, one of the great emerging technologies right now is three-dimensional printing, which is getting beyond simple objects to being able to print a house or print a living organism. And what these things do basically is break everything in physical existence down to component parts, kind of like your dot matrix printer 20, 30 years ago used to do. And the individual monads that make up the physical structure are translated into bits, and they're transmitted virtually, so that, kind of like in Star Trek, I can sit on this side of the room and print out a house or a dog on the other side of the room, and that's the direction that we're going. One aspect of that is going to be guns, which we're already starting to see. Guns can be printed at home. Once that becomes ubiquitous, I don't care if the Supreme Court suddenly changes and becomes, in favor of gun regulation. Governments will be able to regulate guns all they want to, but people are going to be printing their guns at home instead of going to gun shows. And there's going to be virtually nothing the government can do to stop that. So if you take all of these things, information, 3D printing, blockchain, any of the technologies emerging today, what they really do is break things into parts in ways that undermine virtually all forms of authority and authoritativeness, and allow you to create your own reality, to take things apart, put them back together however you want to. The net result of all that is we all get to create our own reality. Which those of you who are still looking at your phones are doing right now. Now, to me, the net result of all of that is January 6th, and a country where you have half the people who live in a reality that is utterly disconnected from the other half's reality, and that works perfectly. Until, of course, in the analog world, we bump up against each other. But we're living in an age of hyper-democracy where you can create your own thing in every way, including the universe that you think you live in. In a lot of ways, that's really great. That's freeing, that's democratizing, but in a lot of ways, it's leading to exactly the situation that we find politically right now. And I'll stop at that. And Flora, let's take it from there.
Well, yeah, no, the January 6th example is one that I also think is very interesting to touch upon this topic, because one of the things that caught me in your article that you write about is that I think that our assumption is to think of, especially when we use the example of January 6th, to think of this technology as being undemocratic or leading to the breakdown of democracy. And you make the argument that it is not undemocratic, that it's illiberal, and that it is just adapting maybe the way that we see these democracies, because it is the individual creating his or her own world and creating their own self-democracy in a way. You had seen events sort of like the January 6th insurrection coming from several years ago. Like, you talk about it, I've seen you talk about it in different discussions, you talk about it in this article, that it's something that you sort of saw coming by studying these tendencies that we're now seeing of how technology is disrupting democracy. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. For years, my friends all thought that I was just crazy and depressing, and then everything that I said actually happened. So I take a kind of perverse pride in the fact that I was watching TV on January 6th and watching the riot unfold, and I got a text message in the middle of it from one of my former students that said just, I hope you realize we're all waiting for your I told you so. And it's not actually something that I'm glad I correctly predicted. And part of this is peculiar to the personality of Donald Trump, but Trump is, to me, a product of all these other forces, not so much the driver of them. And we had him as president for a reason, because of the emergence of all these things. It was clear to me for 4.5 years that if Trump were elected, which I thought that he would be, and then once he was elected, that if and when he was defeated, that he would not leave office, and that thousands of armed Americans would come to his defense. I don't think that's that hard a prediction to make, actually, although everybody I know told me I was out of my mind. That would never happen, with the ultimate line of defense being that, of course, the Secret Service will physically escort him out of the White House. The thing I got wrong about the January 6th was I didn't think it was going to be an assault on the Capitol. I thought that you would have all these folks ringing the White House and defending the president against the armed forces and all the other instruments of law. But, as I was just saying about the larger picture of an atomized society, a society where it's so hyper-democratic that you can produce the results that you want, that has a lot to do with how we wind up with that kind of situation. The other part of it, which again, is simply a repetition of what has happened throughout history, is that when you have this large degree of technological change, and I think we're seeing, we're living through a time of technological change on a scale of the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution. It's just, instead of taking several thousand years or 150 years, this is all happening within the span of an average individual's working life. There's a tremendous amount of change, and in any kind of change, there are winners and there are losers. The losers tend to get rather upset, and this has happened throughout history. I mean, there were people who rebelled against the agricultural revolution. There's still a lot of people who write, and there's a slew of books coming out these days about how the agricultural revolution is really the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. But there were people who thought that at the time. There were people, obviously, who rebelled against the industrial revolution, and that went on for a long, long time. We're seeing that same sort of thing. I expect that we're going to see not just more atomization, but a lot more violence than what we're seeing now. And I expect that to go on for, roughly another decade or so. I don't think that's surprising, nor is it anything new. This is what has happened throughout human history. We just happen to be living the Chinese curse of living in interesting times. And I think it's very interesting times. I think we'll probably come out well on the other side. But in the interim, there's a lot of change going on, and a lot of it's very, very difficult. And that's going to affect every aspect of life, as I said, from who we live with and how we live to how we govern ourselves as a society. And we have not yet solved those issues. We have not yet come up with the new paradigm. I think largely because both on the left and the right, what we're trying to get back to is the way it used to be before everything started going wrong. But that's not how history ever answers anything. We need to figure out, what does democracy look like in the 21st century, not what it looked like in 1960 or 1860. And we're not doing enough of that. To me, that's the problem, and this will continue until we start doing that.
One of the things that I thought was interesting is this concept of how our wars and the battles, with the exception of what we're seeing in Ukraine, are going more and more virtual, and how this battlefield is turning more and more virtual. Obviously social media has had a big impact on a lot of this, of how we communicate, of how people reach like-minded individuals or people who are their supporters. And, I couldn't help but think about your article today as I'm seeing all the news with Elon Musk and Twitter and the takeover and the firing of half of Twitter's employees, including a lot of the people who work in the curation team and public policy team. And so, it almost made me feel like owning Twitter, does that now make Elon Musk the kingmaker in this theme of virtual worlds ruling how we move forward? I mean, obviously it's too early to tell, but it was one of those things that I couldn't help thinking about a lot of the themes of your article. I was reading some of the things going on at Twitter today.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that question, like any other possible question, includes about a half dozen different topics that we could touch on. I mean, I'll just note that the war in Ukraine is not just a physical war. I mean, it's not an exception to it. In a lot of ways, the most successful element of the war that the West is waging back is essentially a virtual war of ones and zeros that's undermining Russia financially. Much more so, although not alone, with what we're doing on the battlefield. So the virtual, as well as what they call in the military world the kinetic, in other words, the stuff that you actually feel, they're equally important. And in a lot of ways, the balance of war is in fact shifting to the virtual, and will do so more and more in years to come. In terms of Twitter, I mean, it's an interesting question in a lot of ways about how all that will unfold. Obviously, owning Twitter makes Musk very powerful and causes a lot of concern for a lot of people. At the same time, it's easier to exit from virtual worlds than it is from physical worlds, frankly. And you know, one of the great works of political science that I've discovered that young people today have never read but was central to my political science education when I was in college is a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Albert O. Hirschman, I believe, is the author, and everybody should go and read it. And it basically argues that to have a legitimate political system, people either have to have voice or they have to have exit. And the virtual world is going to make exit a lot easier. And I think that 20, 30 years from now, government as we know it isn't really going to exist. There will be all kinds of different forms of governance, and a lot of that will be through virtual entities. You will be able to choose your government, which makes government a lot more responsive if you can up and leave by pushing a button instead of having to sail across an ocean. Now, you know, there's all kinds of implications for that, but I think to some degree we're seeing an early form of that debate with Twitter because, you know, liberals are basically debating, do we stay on Twitter and, you know, keep it the way we want it, or do we get out of there? I mean, I gave up on Twitter years ago. My guess is that lots of people will, and it's just, you know, it's relatively easy. It's certainly easier to start a new Twitter than it is to start a new United States. And people will do that. I assume that within the next couple of years, an alternative to Twitter, other than just Truth Social, is going to evolve, and people will be choosing their own forms. I mean, there already are alternatives to Twitter that are, you know, extreme right wing. So it's not like you can't do that. And more so, you're going to be able to create your own town square. You'll be able to create your own government, and people will be able to choose these things. And it's going to be, you know, easier to move around. And you know, ultimately, the Elon Musks of the world and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world are going to wind up where King John found himself in England when he got surrounded by his barons at Runnymede. I mean, at some point, you can't suppress people forever, and people are going to demand either they get their voice or they get their right to exit. And you're going to see a lot more of that in the digital world, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say that that's also, you know, we've seen these things of the disruptions or maybe the ways that democracy is changing, but we also see a lot of the positive changes that technology has brought and the equalization factor and the allowance for maybe like-minded people to connect with people from other parts of the world who might have similar interests and who maybe were voices that were oppressed and weren't heard. I mean, we're seeing now the uprising in Iran with women taken to the streets because of what they saw, mostly shared over social media, of the attack on a woman who was killed for no reason. And so I think that one of the things that you point out is that it's not so much that we're heading towards the end of democracy, it's just that democracy is going to have to change, or the system that we know as democracy is going to have to evolve to where we are today.
Yeah, and as we were talking about the other day, you know, there's a simple example of where I think the virtual world's headed in our real world today. And you know, you can think of this as not democratic or as democratic, but we've already evolved, you know, even pre-Trump in this country and in most other countries, in fact, to a situation where elections don't matter all that much. And they don't matter because, I don't know, I know you wanted to talk about the upcoming election. There are a lot of blue states where Democrats are going to be going down next week, but for the most part, you know, if you live in California, you know who's going to win the election. If you live in, I was going to say Oklahoma as an example, but now we don't know who's going to win the election. But in general, you know, people have self-segregated physically. And I believe that they will do that electronically as well because it's a lot easier. But, you know, you can argue, well, we don't live in a democracy because your vote doesn't matter in California or Texas or Oklahoma because it's already decided. But that's a different form of democracy. People are choosing their government by moving there instead of moving there and then choosing the government. And I think that's essentially what we'll get online. It's just a lot easier that way. Now, is that undemocratic because we're not having elections that are deciding the results of things? No, I don't think that's just a different form of democracy. I always give this example of my next door neighbor whose political views are 180 degrees removed from me. And we're going to have to coordinate on certain things in the physical world, like the road in front of our house that we each can't get to our property unless we drive down this road. We have to, if our town installs a sewer line, we're going to have to share the sewer line. We're going to have to make decisions about who pays for it and how often does it get fixed jointly with ourselves and our neighbors. But in terms of most of what government came to do in the 20th century, there are going to be other alternatives to paying for it through the government to get most of this stuff done. And, I think that 10 years from now, Lance is going to sit in his house and hit a button that says, I want to join virtual Mississippi, and I'm going to hit a button that says, I want to join virtual Massachusetts. And that'll just be swell, and we'll be making our own choices on that.
So how do you think that, what do you see ahead of these midterm elections? How do you expect, since you seem to be the one who can predict outcomes with certain things, and as your friends have told you in the past, what do you see? We have two interesting races in our home states, in Georgia and in Pennsylvania, that are coming up in the midterms. How do you see these concepts affecting, if in any way, these upcoming elections coming up on Tuesday?
There was an interesting piece by David Brooks that just came out, I think, yesterday, that said essentially nothing's affecting these elections. It's coming out exactly the way you would have expected a year ago. And I think largely the same thing could have been said about the last election. People are baked into where they're at. And Brooks was arguing that's because of, a similar thing to what we've been discussing. There are two different realities out there now. And at the end of his article, he kind of bemoans that, 20, 30 years ago, people could live in a community that had a different, very different viewpoint from another one, and it was okay. We get it. We don't agree, but we're all Americans. We live together. It's fine. And he says, like a lot of other people, that he's seen that disappear, and now we hate each other and want to kill anybody from this different world. I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, because these changes are very threatening in a lot of ways. I think that there is in fact a social survival issue here. I mean, a lot of people look at the people on the other side, quote unquote, and that's true of people on both sides, whichever it is. And they look at the other folks and say, these folks are nuts. They think that they think that we're assaulting them, and their whole way of life is being taken away, and that's what's driving it. And I wish they could just get sane. Well, both sides think that about each other, and both sides are in fact correct. I think that the lifestyles that we're talking about are, and the ideologies constructed around them are so inimical to each other, in the same way that the Industrial Revolution, when it came, was largely inimical to the society that came before. And, it destroyed communities. People picked up and moved to London, and the towns were eviscerated. A lot of baronial life and the agricultural life was destroyed by the enclosure movement and the encroachment of private property that was a logical outgrowth of the growth of industrial capitalism. People's family structures changed. Everything changed. And you saw an entire way of life obliterated. It is not unreasonable for half of this country to think that their life is being obliterated. I think it is unreasonable to think that it's being done intentionally by a cabal of liberals who want to wipe them off the face of the earth. But, there are changes going on that are wiping out some things that some people hold dear. The response to that, the backlash against that, is a threat to some things that the other half of the country holds dear. That is not a situation that's ripe for amelioration by normal political means, and it's not going to be. It's going to be changed, eventually as things evolve through the wheels of history. What we have an obligation to do is to figure out how to get through this change with each other as well as possible without killing each other. And as I said, we're not doing a very good job of that so far.
On that note, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Linda.
Eric, thank you. And I want to ask you about one of your other projects that kind of feeds into what you were just talking about, and that is you are actually living out the theme of this conference, and that is building bridges. Can you tell us about your efforts to reach out to the other side and have dialogue?
Sure. Interestingly enough, it's more the other side who reached out to me. And this came about because I have an annual conference I sponsor that gets into these issues of how technology is changing government and how you can make a difference in this changing world. And one of the panels a couple of years ago, we had a foreign policy, it was a foreign policy panel, and I wanted to get some diversity of viewpoints. And I invited a guy who is, as it turns out, very dug into the Trump world. And we kind of hit it off. I mean, we get along well, and we like each other, we've stayed in touch. And he read an article that I wrote after the 2020 election that was, I think, rather gloomy in outlook. And he wrote to me out of the blue and said, that he read the piece and he actually agreed with what I was saying, and that a lot of other people in MAGA world agreed too. And they were very concerned about the future of the country, want to avoid a civil war. We believe that maybe we can't agree, but we can at least try to understand and talk to each other. Would I be interested in setting up that kind of a dialogue? And so we're in the early stages of this. We've had one discussion where we brought in a variety of people across the political spectrum, and it was interesting in a large number of ways. I was very much struck by how much my point of view coincided with a lot of the views of the MAGA people, and in some ways that it did not. One of the striking things in these long conversations that I've had with my MAGA interlocutor is that we've kind of come to describe it as an inverse, a mirror image of each other's views of the world. When we talk about, at a kind of abstract level, of what we see the problems are and what worries us, it's almost exactly the same. It's just, to me, he's the problem, and to him, I'm the problem. But, the underlying values, and this is the thing that struck me about the conversation, the underlying values are in a lot of ways. There was one individual there, and we're operating under a kind of form of Chatham House rules, so we don't discuss what a specific individual said. But there was one part where somebody whose name you would recognize went into a kind of monologue about what they believe, and ended each of the sentences with, and that's why I'm a conservative, and blah, 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 and that's why I'm a conservative. And when she finished speaking, I said, if you printed that out and just changed the word conservative to liberal and handed it to all my friends, they'd think I wrote that. I mean, like, verbatim. Why she is a conservative is exactly why I'd say I'm a liberal. And what a lot of, you guys are all communications people, so I think you probably know this. There's a lot that indicates that you can't talk to people about facts that differ from their perceptions of the fact. And that's even more dug in with the technological phenomena that we've been talking about here. What you can talk to people about is values. You can't change their minds by arguing that their perceptions of the facts are wrong. Where you can reach people who disagree with you is on building bridges as to where you agree on values. And to my surprise and pleasure, I'm finding there is a lot to talk about with at least certain segments of the population who totally disagree with me on issues, but it turns out, we believe in democracy. We believe in what makes America great. We believe in freedom of speech, and that people should be able to live the lives they want as best they can. And shockingly to some of them, it turns out I'm not a Leninist who wants to impose some, communist regime on them. And, in my view, neither is Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama. And they don't believe that they're fascists who want to impose some kind of horrid regime on me. And, starting with those values gives us a place to start talking, where talking about facts and reality actually gets you nowhere, because I live in a certain reality and they live in a certain reality, and those bridges that's not going to be bridged, not that chasm.
Thank you.
Sure. Whoever gets the microphone.
Thank you. I apologize, it's a little bit of a long question because it touches on so many things that you brought up. You first talked about the physical structures of the schoolhouse or hospitals, and I think there's a physical structure that we still use today that is part of the problem of our democracy, and that's the voting booth. It's a physical structure. It's someplace, imagine if we could do voting online like Eastern European countries, where you no longer operated just within a community, but rather you did it with privacy. And then you were able to be more inclusive and have much higher participation rates, which would eliminate part of the primary process where you get the extreme left and right. And I'm just wondering, do you think that politics are so much part of our community that perhaps it's overstated in our community and maybe we need to take it back a little bit for ourselves? And before we say we can't trust doing something online like voting, we do banking online. So if people are willing to bank online, I think that it's open, there's an open opportunity to doing more voting within the privacy, maybe being able to allow for dialogue on issues versus a direct confrontation about, I see you're a Republican registered to vote here, and I know you're a Democrat, and I know you haven't voted in 4 years, and you voted last Tuesday.
Yeah, well, you know, as you said, there's a lot of aspects to the question, and there's a lot of possible answers to that. I mean, I think we'll inevitably evolve to voting online for lots of reasons that you hinted at. I mean, you know, it's not just that we bank online, but if you own any stock, nowadays you're pretty much voting online. I mean, you know, and it's sure that's not electing a president, but there's billions and billions of dollars riding on these corporate elections. And, you know, virtually everybody except the United States government has figured out how to move into the 21st century and conduct elections. I think we will eventually wind up doing that. But, you know, there's this famous line attributed to Winston Churchill, which, like half the lines attributed to famous people, you know, he probably never said, but you know, everybody uses it, that Churchill once said that you can always count on the United States of America to do the right thing after it's tried every other alternative. I think that's probably a good description of human beings generally. I think we'll eventually get there. But right now, you know, with the emphasis on you know, the ballot security and so forth, we're moving in the opposite direction. The people who think that our elections are a mess want to move more and more to paper ballots instead of election machines. You know, because the election machines are being zapped by space lasers and Hugo Chavez 5 years after his death or whatever. Well, you know, in a prior life, I was a lawyer, and a lot of work that I did was around elections. And I've been involved in paper ballot recounts. And I can tell you, you do not want paper ballot recounts of your vote. I mean, they can be gamed a lot more easily than machines can. And those can be gamed more easily than the electronic voting systems that are springing up around the world. You mentioned Eastern Europe. You know, a lot of what I've written about is Estonia, which is kind of the world leader in this. You know, they've got their whole system on blockchain. Everybody votes. I mean, the parliament votes online. The cabinet meets online. Voters vote through, I mean, virtually nobody votes in person. Virtually nobody does anything in Estonia, you know, in person. It's all virtual. You want to buy a hot dog on the street, it's done on your phone. Nobody uses currency. Nobody goes to the DMV. Nobody except people like over the age of 85 do anything to vote other than on their computers. And it's perfectly secure. Which raises all kinds of interesting issues I thought you were going to go into a couple minutes ago about the surveillance society and so forth, which we can talk about. But, you know, the interesting thing with Estonia's view of blockchain is that because everything is recorded, everything is essentially open to surveillance, the government can't do all the crazy deep state stuff that the right is concerned about in this country, and they actually love Estonia. Because if a government official went in and tried to monkey with your records in some fashion, there would be a record of that, and it creates transparency. Now, I'm not sure Americans would go for that kind of oversight, but, you know, all of this stuff is coming, and we're going to find a solution. And, you know, clearly, as with everything else, paper ballots are no more the future than paper money is. And yeah, you know, we'll get to the point where you have secure online elections because we have secure online, you know, everything else.
I just want to follow up on that with something that you had said. You know, we obviously are seeing that people are becoming more and more set in their ways with the way that they see things. But then you talked about these bridges that are formed and that you're able to find these bridges and commonalities sometimes when you do have these interactions. If our voting system and things like that are still communal at this point move to an online or fully online arena, will that ultimately isolate people more and more and make us more set in our ways and make us more trapped in these bubbles that we've already created through these algorithms and through these systems that have already been in place that keep us more and more isolated from other points of view?
Well, the short answer, I suppose, is yes. but obviously there's a more complicated answer to that. I think, as I alluded to before, part of where we'll be moving with voting is, moving as opposed to voting, although it'll be virtual moving. I think that we're going to see 10, 20 years from now, online governments you can choose to join. But if and when that starts happening, it's going to be a lot more than government. What you'll really see created online are communities. Because what we have to get to in terms of social media are social media that have a different business model than what we've seen today. All that anybody's come up with to have a company like Facebook or Twitter is you either sell advertising or you extract data from people so that your users are your product, and you take away all their privacy, take away all the information about them, and then sell that to advertisers so the two run together. As long as that's the case, everything that we all know is wrong with social media is going to continue to be wrong with social media and get even more so. So, what if you had a Twitter or Facebook that made its money off of something else and then provided an online community that didn't care about getting your data, ripping you off, stripping you of your privacy, and selling it for a profit because it gets money from someplace else, which is more or less what communities in the real world, not what Mark Zuckerberg thinks is a community, that's what they really consist of. That's how they're really formed. And, I think that in 10 to 20 years, when we start getting governments and communities of choice online that are providing the real things that real communities provide, which is, a sense of governance, a sense of trust, and the opportunity. And I see this as an opportunity, which is where, my virtual Mississippi, my virtual Massachusetts differs from Lance's virtual Mississippi, the opportunity to invest in each other in meaningful ways, both monetarily and non-monetarily. And communities that form on that basis, because I choose to be in the virtual Mississippi, and Lance, I'm sorry, I keep getting this wrong. I choose to be in the virtual Massachusetts. Lance chooses to be in the virtual Mississippi. Well, we're selecting the same way that people are now geographically by values, and communities spring up around that. And you will have social media that that better reflect these kind of values, and where you start having more community and more of a way of getting at what is a agreed truth and agreed reality, and a lot more sharing, and I think that works a lot better. Now, the problem that you'll have then is that you're going to have a lot more harmony within your garden, within your community, but you'll have friction between them. Which, of course, is the story of human history anyway. I don't think that's going away, but it's shifting the locus from my neighbor and I want to kill each other to my community and the other community are at war in some fashion, and then we got to figure out how you manage that, which in the 20th century we actually did a reasonably good job of in the real world. We have to get to the point where we can do that in the virtual world as well.
Something went wrong.
Speaking of disruptive.
So if you want people to have more discourse, whether it be about the same or differing topics, but not being able to see their realities if they're so divergent, wouldn't that be the opposite of what we're trying to do, is to bridge people?
I mean, to the extent that we're living in different mental universes, for one thing, I think that will dissipate with the normal course of history. Whether that comes out positively or negatively, I don't know. I mean, I tend to view it as that it will come out positively. But we're not going to be living in the same economy. We're not going to be living in the same social reality 20 years from now that we are now. So, the difference between a Luddite and a London merchant in the early 19th century kind of goes away by the early 20th century. There's change, and people start to live in more of the same reality. So I think that answers part of it. But in terms of creating structures that more or less allow you to migrate to the notional, virtual country of your own dreams, where everybody within the walled garden is just like you. I mean, as I just said, I think, that's going to translate the conflict to a different level, from the individual to the group level. But we largely have that already today, you know? I mean, people are not talking to each other. People are living in these different realities. How do you bridge that? I mean, part of that will be organizationally, you know, if everybody who has one particular point of view and everybody who has another particular point of view are living within different constructs that have their own economies and their own armies, and you're going to have conflict. I mean, we're going to have to find ways of mediating conflict between entities. You know, as I said, we did more or less successfully in the second half of the 20th century, but of course that was only after going through the first half of the 20th century. And I think we're going through something similar now. So I think a lot of that resolves itself. But beyond that, yeah, you know, we need to find ways that people can talk to each other, both technologically and in the real world, in ways that we're not doing now. And, you know, as I said before, I think that a lot of that turns on people who study communications, people like the people in this room, who are realizing that, you know, reaching people through values and other sorts of commonalities rather than arguing about the facts is the way that you do it. Maybe sports is going to be the answer, but it's clearly not going to be telling people, no, you're wrong, Donald Trump lost. I mean, we tried that. Didn't work, obviously, right? And they're not convincing, I'm guessing most of you in the room think Joe Biden won. They're not going to convince you that it was all fraudulent and Joe Biden, you know, is actually an automaton who was replaced 3 years ago or whatever. You know, those kinds of factual discussions get us nowhere. We've got to be finding something else to talk about, and, you know, and I think it's basically at the value level. And we'll figure out how to do that better.
Yes, thank you, Eric. This is an excellent analysis. You have a structural analysis. I think you cited Albert Hirschman before.
Yeah, yes.
You know, 30 years ago, he had a book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, and I think it's instructive for us as kind of students and scholars of communication. He kind of did a deep dive into kind of almost 3 stock arguments or narratives that reactionaries use. He didn't say conservatives, but reactionaries. And then a kind of a gentle critique of some progressive arguments or narratives. I really like the point you made on kind of our talk. You know, as a student of communication, I'm interested in words, our language use, our arguments, and our narratives. So focusing on values is key. Do you have I don't know, might be a tough answer to give, but is there some kind of argument in that Hirschman sense, an argument or narrative that could broach kind of a reactionary, conservative, and maybe progressive perspective to form some kind of community?
You want an argument that convinces somebody who disagrees with you that you're right?
No, something that would maybe broach those two sides. You know, an argument for the conservative argument from jeopardy, futility, things like that.
Well, you know, there are people who want to blow up the world. There are people who hate everybody else and want to kill them. But I don't think that's the great mass of humanity. And I don't know how you reach those folks. But I think overall, despite the fact that we're split into 2 warring camps who are both equally convinced that the other wants to eliminate them, the vast majority of human beings, and certainly the vast majority of Americans, think we share things in common, and we in fact do. And we need to continue, we need to return to those conversations. I mean, just the little dialogue that we've had in this group that Linda alluded to, I think is useful. Yeah, I had this one conversation with the guy who started it with me, where somehow or other we got off into the fact that, you know, in my earlier life I was a civil rights lawyer, and I started talking about, you know, why. And you know, it's because I really find the values of the U.S. Constitution to be terribly important. I think the Constitution is one of the greatest constructs of any human society ever, and particularly a committee. No committee ever has produced a better document than the U.S. Constitution. It has its faults, but you know, it's a remarkable testimonial to what people can devise in terms of how we can live together and how we can function in a way that promotes both social order and a value of freedom and liberty. And and that's why I became a civil rights lawyer. I think these things are important. I think freedom of speech is important. Freedom of religion is important. The values that I believe this country was founded on, really matter. And I kind of take that for granted as being something that makes up who I am and where my values are coming from. This other guy found that kind of, both illuminating and shocking, that from what he could tell, all people on the left side of center hate the country, want it torn down, want to impose some kind of gulag society and all the rest of them. And he found it both encouraging and enlightening to discover that there might actually be a liberal somewhere in America who loves America and what it stands for and thinks it's can be a light to the world. And I find it surprising that anybody could think otherwise, but we think these things of each other because we don't talk to each other enough. And it's too simple to say, but it's a good metaphor for all of this. A lot of the reason is because we're spending all of our time staring at our phones instead of talking to each other. And we're only interacting with people who are just like us. There's a reason why the vast majority of Trump voters believe that Trump couldn't possibly have lost the election. It's not just because Trump says so. It's because they don't know anybody who voted for Biden. They literally do not know anybody who voted for Biden. It's easy to see how you're shocked that Biden got 77 million votes if you live in a world like that, But yes, we need to be doing a lot more to be encouraging conversation in some fashion across these boundaries. And, as the prior panel noted, sports may be it. Although, being from Philadelphia, you don't want to be an Astros fan at, the Citizens Bank Park. There's plenty of vitriol there. But we can find ways to talk to each other outside of the ways we currently are not talking to each other.
Thank you so much, Flora and Eric, for this stimulating discussion. We would like both of you to come back to Pizza and Politics. Maybe, Eric, you can make it 2 in a row, and Florida, we'll try to rig the election so you get a pizza too, okay? Thanks again.